But Matthew Wallace is our final speaker. Just for case of streak, don't blow my time. you have plenty of time.
Probably not a huge problem. So what was interesting to me today is I think probably unlike a lot of the room, I maybe am a little less of a network engineering background than a lot of people. And I held that title officially for about 3 weeks before I got dragged into the network security world a long time ago. But it's cool to hear how many things resonated with me. I've spent about 8 years of my life as a developer now. And so a lot of the context that I want to bring to the sort of SDN discussion today is how are developers thinking about SDN? What does it mean to them? Probably some of it's stuff you're not going to want to hear. I've also spent another 8 years now collectively doing something working for data center providers. So now I'm director of product development at ViaWest. Before that, many years ago, I spent 6 years working at Exodus Communications, which, in the sort of heyday of the internet was a really enormous service provider, one of the first big colo providers. There I was doing security work, and so I have a lot of security context about when I think about SDN and when I think about cloud, a lot of that, my security background always comes to fore. I'm constantly thinking about how are you going to exploit SDN, because it's usually the first thing that comes to mind. So just for background, I'm just going to talk for a second about ViaWest. So we have 27 data centers now across 5 or 6 states in the United States, and we've grown from this tiny facility here in downtown Denver that I want to say has a couple thousand square feet of raised floor to the newer facilities are getting into the 100,000 square foot range. So absolutely enormous facilities. Some of which have actually done some interesting things like the whole, Tier 4 design certification in Las Vegas, things like that are sort of groundbreaking. But I'm not really a data center person from the physical space. To me, they're just big buildings with lots of redundant power. We can put, compute. And so compute's where I get interested. And why do we have compute? Because we want to run applications. And so I'm really oriented around that. And so my focus at ViaWest is around the service development so that we can take things to our customers that makes their life easier. And most of them, all of this is plumbing. From the data center, the electricity, all the power whips, even all the compute, they don't really care what it is that we're picking and why we run it. They just want it to be reliable. They want it to work and get their applications to their customers. So I want to talk for a second about how developers think, and I've actually used this same sort of stack thing to show an orientation around just IT thinking in general, and the way developers think about IT, and the way IT people think about IT. Developers want to write their application, so they want a bunch of services that work for them. So their application needs to talk to other applications, it needs to talk to consumers, it needs services to make it work, like DHCP to tell their hosts what address to be on, or DNS so the end consumers can go and reach those hosts. They want to know things like, I'm sitting on this server, my code is running, how much CPU am I actually using? How much network bandwidth am I using? Am I consuming lots of resources? Should I give more RAM to my database server? I mean, their whole orientation really is just about how is my application working? And as I go through my few slides here, I'm really going to just start lodging a whole bunch of complaints about all the way that this stuff works today, because it's actually very difficult to operate some of these things from, I think, the developer perspective, because when you're sort of an operator and you're an expert and you're a network engineer and you've got a lot of visibility into your devices, you've got a lot of visibility into your cloud infrastructure, it's very easier to go in and figure out what's going on underneath the hood. As an application developer, these guys, there are whole sub-industries now, like, all the stuff like New Relic and Boundary and so on, who are springing up to monitor application performance, because if you're a developer, you have a very hard time when your application isn't performing well, figuring out what's actually going on here. Why is this not doing what I expect it to do? Let's talk a little bit about the relationship between SDN and cloud. So software-defined networking, is this sort of wave of programmability and so on and so forth, and not to quibble over what exactly is the definition, because we can talk about how it varies from person to person, group to group all day. But I think what's key is with the cloud world, applications are going to move around. They're going to get deployed on different infrastructure. They're going to be moved between availability zones. You've got developers now who are building all their applications inside of containers on their laptops. They've got VMware Fusion or Vagrant with Docker, and they're building those applications there, and they expect the networking, fake networking essentially, that's on their laptop to deploy into a cloud infrastructure and more or less just work for them, right? So the challenge for all of us as data center providers and network operators, and especially vendors, a lot of my comments are out there oriented towards the vendors in the room, really is to make it really easy for those end users to get the sort of service portability that they need so that their applications run the same way predictably everywhere, and that they have great visibility into what's going on there. So talking a little bit about ISP thinking, right? So a little bit less, from our perspective as a service provider, some of the very first things that I think about, and I would love to think about how cool everything is all day and how much kind of new sort of groundbreaking things we can do, but in the end I end up having to spend a lot of time thinking about sort of the plumbing again, right? How manageable is this? When somebody calls into my technical assistance center and I have a kind of little wet behind the ears, maybe doesn't have 20 years of experience debugging all these kinds of things, engineer in the field, what sort of instrumentation, what sort of visibility, what sort of diagnostics tools do we have? So one of my big complaints so far about sort of the SDN solutions that I've seen is sometimes they have APIs and so on and so forth, but they don't necessarily have a lot of easy to use diagnostics. They don't pipe that information around, they don't aggregate it, they don't summarize it very well. And of course, again, this is a place where cottage industries are springing up. So now you've got people like, say, Splunk or all kinds of other companies where all this data is being piped so that they can graph it for you. And from my perspective, it's sort of like, if you're selling me a technology solution and I have to have yet another technology solution just to tell me what's going on with your solution, you'll probably have a little bit of a gap there. And again, people in this room, I think sometimes we take for granted how much benefit we get from 15, 20, 30 years or more worth of experience, all these technologies. We have to go back and think about how, somebody who's only got a year or two of technology experience and is having to kind of operate this stuff, how they kind of interact with it. So visibility is important. Cost matters a lot, and I'm going to have a whole slide where I start complaining about SDN business models, right? But let's talk just a little bit here about how there's some problems about SDN and some of the things that are coming. And first of all, I'll say that we use VMware as a cloud stack, and so a lot of my experience, and not complaining too much about VMware because I did work there for 2 years, so I actually probably have bias towards them rather than against them. But if you look at some of the solutions that they've got, say for a virtualized firewall appliance, you would be absolutely horrified to actually be in the position where you needed to get the equivalent of a supervisor port on a virtual firewall. They work great when they're working, nominally well, and when something goes wrong, you practically need to, tear the virtual appliance apart and start plugging in physical wires. And, when you finally actually do sniff the traffic, you see that's all encapsulated at another time. You have to figure out how to strip the encapsulation off manually. And you're thinking, do you guys really deploy this as a production product? Because did you never think that anything would ever go wrong? We'd never need to debug. So I guess my plea out there to the sort of vendors of the world is try to think about how your software and how your product basically interacts with the world when things go wrong, right? So don't start with the ideal world, assume things have gone horribly astray, and then figure out how I'm going to debug it from there. Interoperability can be a big problem too, of course. As a provider, we end up having to deal with this incredibly heterogeneous infrastructure, right? So we have dozens of vendors, we have customers that use platforms of all types, we've got every operating system under the sun. And even though it seems like we literally have every single product that's known to humanity somewhere inside of our facility, somebody always still comes to us going, hey, can you run this? And we're like, we've never heard of that, So because of all the need for that interoperability, when you start looking at some of the platforms today, especially when it comes to the orchestration layer and the control plane that's so important to dealing with, actually deploying all these and making them automatable and getting them to talk to each other, I feel like vendors out there today have a little bit of my world myopia. So, they have, especially the bigger you are and the more things you've got under your roof, the more likely you are to have this huge stack of things where all of your stuff works talking to itself but doesn't interoperate very well with other things. And so again, what I'd say is unless you have an absolutely dominant position, everybody's coming to you to write stuff onto your platform, you should probably think a little bit more about interoperability as well. Thanks. So speaking of SDN, I'm a big fan of network function virtualization, and for me, this was almost like the definition of SDN for a while. And we're now seeing a huge need, in our space in the data center business for overlay networking as well, because customers who have needs for dedicated VLANs and need to extend their networks across multiple data centers, or want to move cloud workloads between data centers, and they want to keep all the same networking attributes, and you don't get to do that without that sort of programmable software-defined networking. But for me, it all started with NFV, and part of that is because we have run across plenty of people who have very limited networking needs, and most of you in this room are going to laugh when you think about how do you design network solutions for people who they only need 1 megabit per second, burstable to 5. It's slower than your Comcast connection at home, and they're actually asking you to rate shape them so they don't accidentally blow through the roof of that. They want to plug into a gig port, but they don't want to use more than 5 megs. But you have to think for a second about how the economics work for that person, because we can't go and stick some huge piece of metal into a rack that we pay $10,000 or $15,000 or $20,000 for, more for the HA pair, more for the support, more for all the hands-on to go and put it in and deal with the hardware life cycle and all this. So NFV comes to the rescue for those folks. And as a data center provider, we're kind of, when we're running services for people, we have the potential to be this aggregation point where we can provide this sort of turnkey service for a bunch of people, but you can't go and sell it as if it's a $25,000 appliance, basically, when what we're really dealing with is like a meg of traffic, and I could probably run it through my iPhone if I had the right software. So my plea is make sure that your business model is kind of aligned with the sizing of your appliance. And we've actually got some kind of growing awareness of this, and we've had some people come to us who are actually very flexible with their business model and really good about this kind of thing. But definitely, keep in mind that with this sort of software-defined life cycle, we need to be worried about refresh cycles. So, we're no longer replacing necessarily the hardware at the same time as we're replacing your software, and charging for upgrades and things all factors in. So. Multi-tenancy. This is my biggest pet peeve as a service provider. One of the things that we've detected here is that there's this interesting trend amongst our customers where they want to co-manage everything, which when you actually spend a bunch of time developing good control planes and good management procedures and so on and so forth, you run into this scenario where when people want to co-manage, you're like, so you're going to break it and we're going to fix it for you, right? That's what that means, co-manage. But people who are out there, again, we're talking about those developers, they've got their needs, they want to see what's going on, they want to see what they're consuming and how they're consuming it. And so we're kind of have to go down that road of co-managing things with them. And one of the biggest problems I have with every product out there, not every, but most products out there, is that you're not making it very easy for us to show certain things with the customers, and for us to define by policy, here are the things you can see, here are the things you can interact with. And we have to understand that there are multiple organizations. So we have a customer, maybe they've got their own directory service, they've got their own accounts in that. They want to authenticate into something, maybe our portal, maybe your portal. They want to be able to see infrastructure that belongs to them. Meanwhile, we have an entire staff. We want our staff to authenticate into that infrastructure and be able to touch any part of it. But even when we're touching it, we want it to be very clear to our staff which of our customers they're affecting by tampering with things. And so, the key about multi-tenancy here is just to remember that when you're selling into a service provider market, or even in a big enough enterprise, because now, of course, you've got departmental things where you're kind of losing that sort of central IT control. You've got the CMO spends more money on IT than the CIO does. You have to consider basically that you're going to have those same authentication identity problems even in a large enterprise. So think about multi-tenancy, think about multiple groups accessing products. My first question, anytime somebody shows me an API nowadays, or shows me a user interface, is does your user interface use your API? If the answer is no, it's probably like the biggest black mark against you. And if you tell me on one hand we've got a great API and then your own user interface doesn't use it, I don't even know. I start to feel like you're crazy immediately, basically. So what I really love, and I've fallen in love with vendors because of this, is not only do I see that their API or their user interface uses their API, but I can actually open up something like Firebug and see all their API calls and actually diagnose those, and I can use their own portal or user interface, kind of see how they exercise their own API. So just to touch real quick, since I'm out of time, can't believe I blew through that so fast, or so slowly. Just to touch on this, we've had a lot of people talk today about what are the skill sets of network engineering in the future. And I was speaking at Interop last year, and I had a guy from Yahoo on my panel who was a distinguished engineer there, and he was talking about how Yahoo basically didn't have entry-level engineering positions anymore for network engineers. You literally, if you were coming to Yahoo and you wanted to do network engineering, there was no you needed to have 10 years of experience. You needed to have the certifications. And somebody asked, well, if this becomes a trend and everybody's doing this, how do I break in the door? My answer to that question was, learn to program first. Get the domain expertise for networking, but the value now is in you being able to take your expertise and programmatically distribute it and automate things. And so I think software development skills are the key skill basically for people with networking knowledge to be able to kind of leverage that knowledge outside of their domain in the future. I'm going to skip through this slide. Be interoperable. It's kind of a given, right? Thanks.